Welcome students to the online NPTEL course Visual Communication Design for Digital Media. In the previous lecture we started discussing about the contemporary movements in the visual design. So in the last lecture we started with the post-industrial revolution from the contemporary part. We are not going into the history part of it. History part was just before industrial revolution and Renaissance and industrial revolution. So all this Renaissance architecture and art and design till Renaissance and before that is part of the history. But as new media design and the digital media design is a very nascent and the new field, so to maintain the continuum we should discuss some part of the parallel art movements and design movements. But we started with from the post industrial revolution. So we started with discussing modernism. In modernism also we discuss the smaller different ism within the modernisms from early modern to late modern. In the previous lecture we started discussing from Art Nouveau and then art and craft and art deco, and how gradually they are incorporating more machine made stylization into the biomorphic styles which was before industrial revolution, that was Baroque and Rococo, and how they have changed into the more minimalist style into Bauhaus and the Stigl movement. There are also some other movements like Impressionism and Cubism and other movements which we are not discussing because they are more they have more emphasis and more related to the art movements. So in Impressionism, I just tell you in briefly that Impressionism is more if you want to look at that art movement, you should look at Van Gogh's works, especially Starry Nights and other paintings, and Edvard Munch, for example Scream. So you look at that and you will understand what Impressionism is, but that didn't transform into much into the popular art and the posters and all this design domain. So in today we will discuss about the Futurism, and that has a continuum with the minimalist, the Stigl and the Bauhaus style, but definitely quite different. And also we will discuss a little bit about the Cubist style, and then we will move towards the postmodern movements, and we will mainly discuss the pop art style, and then we will come to the digital media domain, which is very new, and that is why we have to discuss all these things to understand what is there in the how it evolved. So in digital media we will discuss about different emerging visual styles like Skeuomorphism and material design. If you come to the timeline of modern era, some of the modern eras art was already discussed, and we discussed Art Nouveau, art and craft movement, art deco. Impressionism we were not discussing because it's more of an art movement. So you can look at Van Gogh's artwork, Edvard Munch's artwork. So Scream and Van Gogh's Starry Night will be within this era, within this art style. We discussed the Stigl and Bauhaus, and today we will discuss a little bit of Futurism and Cubism, and we will move towards the postmodern style, and mainly we will start discussing the digital media style and what kind of graphics in digital media style we have. Surrealism is another very important era, but that's you can look at and you can read about Salvador Dali and Dada movements and other movements are there, but we are not discussing that because they have more emphasis on the art movement. So before that we discussed the Bauhaus and the Stigl movement, and we gradually started from Art Nouveau, then we come to the art and craft movement, and then art deco. So if you look at that, so from Art Nouveau, the intricacy and biomorphic curvilinear style of design gradually adopted the industrial sense of visual vocabulary, and it came towards more abstraction, more rectilinear form, and more and less biomorphic and less curvilinear aspects. So in Futurism and Russian constructivism, it flourished in Italy and Russia. So it has a lot of other theories, but we'll just discuss about what kind of visual style it has. It talks about motion, and which is and it depicts some sense of time dimension into the picture. So there are a lot of sense of movement. So here we can look at the cycle, rings were moving. Even in some of the painting, you can see the if there are some animals, they're portrayed. There are some 4 or 5 legs which are of less color intensity, so that it gives a sense of dynamism, so that the person, the animal is walking, and to give that sense of illusion of time dimension. That came more predominantly, and that concept came into cubism in the later phase in higher degree. So here we can see a lot of more towards the breaking the form into rectilinear geometry. So geometry, emphasis of geometry is more over here. Here we also have cubism, which also talks about time dimension and capturing time into and 2D figure, 2D painting. So we are not going into detail of that. And again, also it's has a tendency to break the geometry into cubes or rectilinear to enhance the rectilinearity. Here we have Velázquez Las Meninas, which is pre-Renaissance painting, and we have a lot of chiaroscuro effect on that. But that Velázquez Las Meninas is transformed into and Picasso reinterpreted that. So Picasso is a painter, is a famous painter. You all know that from Cubist, his most of the work is from Cubist period. Though he also has some blue period and rose period and other era which doesn't fall within the Cubism. But here we can look at the transformation of a lot of human figures and environment into a lot of geometric of geometric cubes. So and also the surfaces and the figures, and has a lot of a depiction of time dimension. Here we can see the shapes are distorted and broken into pieces. So we perceive, suppose we perceive a form in from all the angles, so it depicts all the surfaces together in a two-dimensional geometry. If you want to read further, you can read about cubism, and also in architecture the equivalent deconstructive style which is there, but which was a postmodern style, which was translated later in postmodern era and has some connection with the cubist movement. Right now we come to the postmodern art movement. So after all this simplistic geometric transformation which happened in modern and high modern and late modern era, and we come to the postmodern style, where again aesthetics and ornamentation started gaining its value and started gaining its emphasis. So it's after all the World War and everything was there. So the economic boom again started. So a lot of emphasis was given in ornamentation and beautification. So it started with Europe and America, and based on popular culture. So it in postmodern, one of the style in art and graphic design, we have pop movement, which based on the popular culture of people. So it's more people centric and involving people and what's their sense of liking, that is more translated into the design. So what is the perspective of people and how they perceive aesthetics, and how what is going on in the popular culture is translated in the art form and design as well. So there was a European center and American center of pop art, so they slightly differ. And so mostly it was in the advertisement, typography, branding, poster design, cinematography, and print media, and all these domains where there is a connection with the people is targeted more. So here we have Roy Lichtenstein's style of pop art. So this style, what is evolved from pop art, is translated and has a genre of comic book, and the graphic novels of that era was depicted by these kind of style. And because they are easy to print, they has less colors and easily can be produced easily. And also there is a European center. This is more of an American pop movement, and this is more of an European center. But this kind of style, European style, is also there present in the American, was also incorporated in America, and this kind of style is also incorporated in Europe. So there is no strong clear-cut line between these two styles. So here we have more of a gradient shape in the gradient colors, and use of different kind of fonts is there in this style. So also Howard Miller have designed some of the posters. So mostly we can see these are the comic book style, and the posters, promotional posters were designed in pop style. And here in the typography used is also has some kind of ornamentation. So here these typefaces are not simplistic and not purely geometric. There are a lot of aesthetic influence in this. So here also we have gradient shapes, but this is Howard Miller is from America, and also we have some kind of style which is followed in the graphic novels and comic books of that era. And again, we were discussing initially the Andy Warhol's work. Andy Warhol's work of 100 soup cans of he was painting the Campbell's soup cans, which talks about the day-to-day life and the same repetition of the same life of each and every day's process. So that talks about people's life and people's liking, and all these things were translated into the design and art. So here we can see the same repetitive form of soup cans, but here the only difference is the flavor of the soup can changes. So that is that depicts our life. So each and every day we consume one can of soup, and the mostly the variation will be in terms of the taste. Here we have a famous serigraphy, which is done from serigraphic traditional print media style, but Andy Warhol have used this extensively, and this is a genre of pop style, and the color palette evolved from that. So Marilyn Monroe's several photographs and the colors has been changed with flat different screen printing style. So one same single screen printing base, and the different colors were applied on top of this. So this kind of style has been also translated into different and many other artists have followed this the style of Andy Warhol's screen printing. Now we come to the digital media. So digital media is much new, and it's a 2000th century it started. And if we look at the digital medias, the way it has changed in terms of visual style. So we initially had, because of the technology constraint, there were a larger pixel size, and so the definition was less. So the designers had to do with had to express the imageries with within larger pixels. So there was less possibilities of gradient using gradient shades. So each and every pixel can have just one color. So that was the constraint. So here we can have initially we can look at the Windows logo. Initially it was pixelated and has combines the style of pixel into their logo, and then they have we also have some digital typefaces which can go with the display system of the low resolution initial digital display system. And one of the example we are all attached with this some games like Super Mario and Prince of Persia of the previous versions. So here we have the pixelated imageries, and each and every pixel has one color, so, and it has a particular visual appeal. And though it was the technology constraint, but this has translated into today's some of the artworks and in game and animation design. So the pixels was used as an aesthetic feature, as an style of the visual design. So one of the very popular game is Minecraft, where if you watch the game Minecraft, it deals with the pixels, and each and every pixels is conceived as a voxel, or the 3D volume of a pixel. So each and every voxel has only one color, and here in the Minecraft, if you see, so it's all pixelated, and it's that kind of visual style is the aesthetic that kind of aesthetic appeal they want to create. Even if you look at the animated film Wreck-It Ralph. Wreck-It Ralph is taken from the Wreck-It Ralph's old video game. Here a lot of 3D images is generated from the 2D pixelated graphics of the older the initial eras of digital visual design style. So if you watch the movie, and if you look at some of the ways how it has been the 3D animation has been designed. So if you look at carefully here in the trees, so these are all has that pixelated visual style, and even the arch is designed in terms of pixels. So they enhance the aesthetic value of the pixels as a and that is the visual style of the Wreck-It Ralph. Even the logo here appears very tiny. If you search the poster of Wreck-It Ralph, the way it is written, the typefaces used over here has a lot of pixelated geometry, and that is the visual style of the movie. Then we have proceeded much farther, and the high resolution, the possibilities of high resolution imageries was there. So after that, there was in Apple's design studio, skeuomorphism was a visual style which flourished with Apple's launch of initial iPhones and iPads and iMacs. So skeuomorphism exploits the way high resolution, the possibilities of depicting real objects in high resolution, so to mimic the visual texture of original material. So that was not possible in the pixelated initial eras of low resolution display system, but the high resolution display system have given that kind of opportunity. So skeuomorphism exploits that facility, and the Greek skeo, the word skeo etymologically it means container, and the morph means shape. So it talks about the material it wants to represent in terms of visual texture. We cannot have a tactile texture which cannot be felt, but visually it appears that kind of material. It can mimic the color and of a wood, of a paper and other things. So we have some examples for initial iPhone and iPads, iBooks store was exactly looks like a shelf. So it gives the opportunity to depict because of the high resolution emergence of high resolution display system, the wooden texture is depicted clearly, and skeuomorphism has a lot of beveled and curved edges. So buttons looks like they are a crystal, and they have a shiny edges. So here even the buttons has a kind of a tactile texture. So it is glossy, and one side there is a light and shadow difference, and it looks like a crystal, and it also has a drop shadow. So there is a shadow under the buttons, so that buttons look they have a volume. And even in some of the iPhone App Store icon logo, they also started using the skeuomorphic style. So but skeuomorphic style gradually again faded because of the initial style of postmodern. We had a lot of aesthetic emphasis on the aesthetics and ornamentation, but gradually we are moving towards a minimalist and simplistic abstract geometry and abstract depiction. So here this is the old iPhone screen, and this is the newer iPhone screen. Here we can clearly see the skeuomorphic style, the qualities of skeuomorphism are again reducing. So here the shadows on top is again reduced in a gradient shade and much more geometric and much more abstract depiction. Here the drop shadows are less. Even the 3D effect of each and every buttons are highly minimized in the newer versions of iPhones. Even if you see the iPhone's app, iPhone's buttons, they don't have much drop shadow, and even the lines are just a color line. So it's not talking about texture and drop shadow anymore. So skeuomorphism is not, it was a visual style, but if we talk about the contemporary style, iOS and as well as the Android platform, it was not as it was in the previous era. Now we have we can look at some of the skeuomorphisms, Apple's guidelines. So we have the iOS platforms. We can go to this website, and Apple have clearly given the guidelines of how to design for Apple's iOS platform. So you can go and check that by yourself, and each and every pixels and how the icons has to be designed, and how everything has been detailed in the in their website. And now we talk about the digital media, the new paradigm of digital media. The material design evolved by Google. So Google's material design is drastically different from skeuomorphic style of iOS platform. So material design doesn't talk about the bevel, curvilinear edge. It talks about sharp, clear-cut rectangular geometry. It's more minimalist than skeuomorphism. So it's it does not have the visual texture of the material. It's just as a simplistic rectangular tiles. So in Google's material design, materials work as a metaphor. So they don't use the tactile, the visual texture of the like skeuomorphism. So material is take a form, they are superimposed, and they can be on top of other, and they cast a shadow, but they are more depicted in terms of color. So the pure geometry, bold and flat color is their features. So here we can see an example of how Google transformed their logo, initial logo, from the new logo. So initial logo has a lot of serif ends, and it's more curvilinear and has a intricate intricacy into it, and it's not as geometric as the new logo. So here we can look at that the O has a tilt, and it's not perfect circle. The new logo, if you look at here in the right hand side, it's pure geometric and it's absolutely sans serif, and it's talk about the material designs minimalist, more geometric approach, and talks about the flat color. So here there are gradients within the material, within the color, but here the shapes are flat and has bold pure geometric shapes. But here its material design is conceptually presented. So in terms of Google's material design concept, material is as a metaphor. So material can be on top, each and every buttons are on top of each other. So they cast a shadow. So if we look at the material designs, you can go and check material design, the website again, they have a clear design guidelines in material design website. So each and every shape is a shape on top of other, so they appear like a different cardboard shapes on top of each other, and they cast a shadow on the shape which is behind them. So there is a concept of figure, foreground and background in the material design, and material can change their form. So the circle can come here and take the form of a rectangle, but again it will be on top of each other, and again some material can merge together and take a bigger shape. So you can again go to the material design guide for the Google, and in this following website. So material design and skeuomorphism, if you look at, so skeuomorphism is more about the texture heavy and talking about the beveled edges and the curved buttons and drop shadows and the light and shadow effect. But here in material design there are shadow, there is just materials cast a shadow on which on the background, and but it's pure geometric and there is no texture, there is just different flat colors are there. and they also do focus on different kind of UI transitions. So you can look at the guidelines of Apple's skeuomorphism and Google's material design, and then in the next lecture we will discuss about the technology advancement. That's very important to understand what are the new paradigms within the digital media paradigm, what kind of new technology advancement is required, so is happening. So we need to adjust your visual skills along that domain, that kind of platform, because there are we are not just confined within the display mode of tablet, laptop and mobile phone. Right now we are if we look at the future, then we are also progressing towards augmented reality and virtual media, virtual reality. So that those parts will be discussed, so that you can incorporate your all visual skills what you have learned into that paradigm of design. Thank you.